Hello, and welcome back to What Now on the Threshold of Life, Death, and Grief. I'm here in the studio with my friends and colleagues,
Red Keating
and David Kennedy.
And I'm Julie Brown. In this episode, we have a guest who is a friend and colleague to all of us. Before recording, we realized all of us have worked with her at some point, to our delight. Tracy Condon, who is a social worker here in the city of Peterborough. And she is here to talk to us about a very important topic tonight of perinatal loss. So Tracy, welcome. Thanks so much for being here.
Thanks for having me. I'm really excited to be here tonight.
So Tracy, just before we kind of dive in, can you just tell us a little bit about you, about yourself, and how you came to be doing this work so our listeners get to know you a little bit?
Sure. So I'm local to Peterborough. Grew up here actually on a farm in Douro. Many of you will know of Douro. Went to Trent and studied psychology and sociology, and then decided that I wanted to work in social work. And so pursued my master's of social work at the University of Toronto. And it was during my education there that I fell in love with women's health and working in pregnancy. I did a placement at a prenatal clinic attached to St. Michael's Hospital. And that's where I thought, okay, I could really see myself working in this field. I didn't get there right away. I started at Children's Aid, as many social workers do. Worked there for 2 years and then worked for 4 years at the Catholic School Board. I did a brief mat leave, Julie's mat leave at Fleming College, which is where I met Red. And then my dream job in Peterborough got posted at the Partners in Pregnancy Clinic. So I've been with the Partners in Pregnancy Clinic, which is a family health team attached to Peterborough Family Health Teams, for 15 years, which I never imagined I would hold one social work position for this long. I pick social work to move around and try different sectors, but I just love working at the family health teams. I love working at the Partners in Pregnancy Clinic and working with women who are pregnant.
And just for our listeners, can you just describe a little more about what the Partners in Pregnancy Clinic is? Because it is a very unique model.
It really is. It's really the only of its kind that I'm aware of in Ontario. Even the prenatal clinic that I worked with at St. Mike's was funded through their hospital, which is really different than Partners in Pregnancy Clinic. We're funded as a family health team. So if you have a family doctor, if you're lucky enough to have a family doctor, your family doctor is likely involved with family health teams. And ours is just a family health team around pregnancy. So I work with a group of doctors who do prenatal care and then do the deliveries at the hospital. And we're a multidisciplinary team with 2 social workers, a dietitian. We have lactation consultants. We kind of joke or say that we're a one-stop shop for pregnancy. So women getting prenatal care can come to our clinic and see a social worker, see the dietitian, and they can come up to 6 weeks after and get lactation support as well.
And it's great to have you here tonight, Tracy. And we've connected on so many different occasions and levels. One of the things, and unfortunately, this is a sound-only podcast, but if it were live, you would see what Tracy and I have in great common, and that is our red hair. And so, and red, of course.
Excuse me.
You even, it's so good with you, you named yourself that. So I think we're kind of outnumbering you today, Julie. But
my natural blonde.
Your natural blonde. Anyway, it's great to have you, Tracy. Maybe just to help us, again, to get started, there's a lot of terms that we hear around pregnancy, and I think around the death of children. So things like, miscarriages and stillbirths and all of those types of terms that we hear. Can you help us understand, some of these terms and how they get defined?
Sure. And it's a bit complicated because there's the medical definition of, miscarriage, stillbirth, pregnancy loss. But I think what is more important is how the parents define it when they experience it. So, typically we think of a stillbirth as, a late term pregnancy loss where the baby dies in utero and then is born. We think of a miscarriage, typically probably like 12 weeks pregnant gestation and below. There's like late term loss, there's lots of different sort sort of medical definitions. And then there's, some babies that are born alive and die very shortly after death, right? At all different gestations. So that would be, newborn or infant loss. And so, what I would recommend to professionals or family or friends, if you have someone that's lost a baby or lost a pregnancy, I would be, taking their direction on what term to use, because that's very important to people going through this. Clients I have, are very upset if they have a later term loss or they consider their loss a stillbirth and someone calls it a miscarriage. That doesn't feel good. So I just always take the lead of the person that I'm meeting with. I use their language or their termination, or their terminology, and I'll even ask them, how do you refer to this? I think that's really, really important to figure out. Even like the difference, like there's miscarriage, even the difference between, say, pregnancy loss or baby loss. You lost your baby or you lost your pregnancy. Even that, distinction can be really important to someone experiencing a loss like this.
That makes so much sense.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that we have to ask them. And we know language is powerful, and that is one of the ways they're beginning to try to make sense of their loss. And one of the ways we make sense is through the language we choose.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah.
The other thing I'd be interested in, and I'm not sure if you have this information right on hand, but how frequent is this? How often does pregnancy loss, perinatal loss happen?
Yeah. So, the studies that I hear quoted most often or most frequently are that 1 in 4 pregnancies end in loss.
Wow.
So that's 1 in 4 pregnancies, not 1 in 4 women. If you think about the people in your life, most women will have more than one pregnancy, right? But 1 in 4 pregnancies.
That's a lot.
It's a lot. It's a high number.
That's higher than I would have thought.
Yeah. Yeah. Now, again, the vast majority of those do happen before 12 weeks. It is a bit more rare past 12 weeks gestation, but those losses do happen too, and, are probably a bit more common than we know. I think that's what we're going to talk about tonight is the uniqueness of this loss, because it's not talked about a lot, right? And it's one of, I know on this podcast you talk a lot about how we don't always do death well or grief well in this society. And I think we especially don't do, pregnancy loss, baby loss well. It's even more difficult topic to talk about.
One of the things I've thought a lot about through the years is how this idea that when someone becomes pregnant, that you don't even talk about the pregnancy, you don't even reveal the pregnancy until after 12 weeks, with the thinking being that if you lose the baby, the pregnancy is not viable, that you wouldn't want to tell people about it. And I'm very interested in that as somebody who had 2 miscarriages myself. And then, of course, when it happens, you do want your people to know, right? Because you need their support. You need work on side often for you because you need to take some time off. And then it does have this grief journey component to it. But I just love to hear your thoughts about that. And has that changed at all, Tracy, over time?
I don't think it has, Julie. And I think about that all the time too. And, I can remember when my friends were having babies, saying that to them, did you ever think about sharing before the 12 weeks? I'm just curious about that thought process, and if you did have a loss, like, wouldn't you want my support or our support as your friend group, And I think it's still very commonplace to wait for some reason. Some of my friends have shared that was a really fun time in their relationship to be the only 2 people that knew, and it was, really exciting. And so I guess, trying to respect everybody's wishes. But I think if people do want to share early, sometimes that's a bit judged, and I'm always curious about that too, right?
One of the things I've wondered is if there's a long history there of some kind of shame attached to the loss of the pregnancy, being that that's something that we don't want to talk about, that there's a shame element to it. When, as we know, for almost like most pregnancy loss, it just happens.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. And I think there is still shame and stigma around losing a baby, pregnancy loss, those kinds of things, unfortunately, right? I think part of that comes from the mystery of it. We don't know a lot about why this happens, and I could bring out my soapbox and talk about women's health and funding and money that goes into women's health or doesn't, but that's not what I'm here for tonight. So I won't do that. But I think a lot of grief involves questions like, why did this happen to me? Why did this happen to my baby? And those are questions that we often do not have answers to or ever get through miscarriage or even later losses like stillbirth.
I think it is, Julie, what you said about a long history. I mean, the whole idea of pregnancy and birth and all of that has really only come out into the public in the last, 30 years or so. I mean, 40 years or so. I remember my mom talking about, that there's when a woman is 9 months pregnant or 8 months pregnant, she really has to be careful that she's not seen in public sometimes. So it's that shaming around that whole, the whole pregnancy and women and body image. Now that's changed, thank goodness. Mm-hmm. But I think that has contributed to this whole secrecy thing, and which ends really as a disenfranchisement of what happens in the grief piece, that we don't want to talk about those things.
Yeah, good point, David. My grandmother, so, not that long ago, had to conceal her pregnancy to be able to continue to work at the Quaker.
Exactly.
Right? So I think that's a good point, that pregnancies only become more kind of mainstream and in the public eye in the last, number of generations. Yeah.
To add to shame, what role does fear play in that first little while? Just because what happens if what if when the what nows of we are past that magical 3-month period, and so we do keep it quiet, whether that's shame, but is fear also a factor?
Yeah. And Red, it's hard to know what comes first, the chicken or the egg, right? If we're saying like you can't share and celebrate and it's something that needs to be quiet in case you lose a baby, of course there's fear then, because it's like, oh, I can't tell people about this because it might not, go past 12 weeks, right? And so I think it's both, but I don't know, how much of the fear comes from this culture of secrecy and not telling and sharing and being joyful. Mm-hmm. And how much of it is again, it is a common thing that happens 1 in 4 pregnancies. So fear, of course, anxiety is going to show up a little bit for that.
It's interesting how this wonderful, exciting, happy time is overshadowed by a potential sense of shame or fear, and then that just creates isolation, right? For those who are supposed to be happy.
Yeah. Yeah. And especially if you have repeated miscarriages, that can be very, very lonely, very isolating. Mm-hmm.
I'll just speak to that personally. I had 2 miscarriages in a row before I had a successful pregnancy, my first pregnancy with my son. And that second and then the third pregnancy when I was pregnant with him, you can imagine like those first 12, 13, 14 weeks is like I felt the hours go by, just every day that would go by thinking, okay, that's one day that's gone by where we're a little bit closer. And that's like the invisible strain, right? That people live with. And that's why I'm just speaking to that idea of, certainly, yes, respecting if people want to keep it private for whatever reasons, but there is this invisible stress and strain, especially when there is a lot of fear there for good reason, especially when there's been multiple loss.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. It's still something we keep pretty quiet. There is still a lot of secrecy with it. If you think, you don't hear people calling in sick because they're having a miscarriage, right? And that's what a lot of my clients face. They're like, what do I tell my workplace? Like, what do I say? I can't go in. I'm bleeding. I'm really uncomfortable. And I'm really sad, And so do I call and say I'm having a miscarriage? I'm not really comfortable saying that, right? And, it's just interesting when you think of it that way, right? And why. We call about many other illnesses and things.
I think the other thing too that in talking to women in these experiences is there's often a great deal of question around, did I cause this, right? So the blame piece of that really becomes a huge piece.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Any of these losses, right? Whether it's, early loss, 6 weeks, all the way to the late stage pregnancy losses. All of the women I talk to and their partners, I talk to their partners sometimes. I'm going to talk about women a lot tonight because that's the patient at our clinic. But the question of, is there something I did? Did I exert myself too much? Did I lift something too heavy? Did I,
not eat the right food?
Not eat the right foods. Did my baby hear my partner and I having a big fight and decided, no way, It's when I first see someone after a loss, it's something I make sure I cover in that session. Like, are you stuck on any thoughts about why this happened? And always there's something that happened in the 48 hours prior or the week prior that they're questioning or wondering.
That they're assigning some special meaning to now.
Yes.
And had the pregnancy loss not happened, they probably wouldn't have assigned any meaning to that event or those words or anything. But, and we've talked about this in other episodes, that is so about our human need to have control, right?
Yeah.
Because uncertainty, randomness is so intolerable for us humans. And so when something devastating like this happens, we want to try to make sense out of it. And if I can figure out where to lay the blame, then I also know where the problem is. And so then I can solve it. But then when we find out you didn't do anything wrong and this just happens sometimes, then we're not left with much to hold on to, are we, around how do we fix this for the next time?
Absolutely. And for the next time is so important because when it comes to pregnancy loss, especially if it was a very much wanted pregnancy, then there's the want to have a child still. Right? Or to have more children. And so I have to figure out how this happened so that it doesn't happen again. But there is no way to do that. Yeah.
And certainly while preventability is a part of all grief, I think this is unique in the sense that, the mother has seemingly, she's the one carrying this life. And so that bearing that responsibility and as you say, Julie, as we talk about not being able to live with randomness, as that if we need to have that adds so much pressure onto that piece of it. Maybe that's part of why it's hard to share too, because we feel like, we did this, and so we don't want this to be talked about.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the societal, pressure to be the perfect pregnant woman, right? Like, don't drink coffee, don't drink or eat pasteurized cheese, or, don't inhale any toxins.
Don't put a piece of bacon on your breakfast sandwich.
Yeah. Yeah. I talk to clients about that all the time. Like, that's just totally unrealistic. That's happening in a healthy pregnancy. But when a pregnancy doesn't, continue, of course, they're going to question that when that's the expectation of being the perfect pregnant woman. And so just, a lot of my work is just really reassuring them, like, this is nothing that you did. If it was, you wouldn't have done it. Like, this is just a random thing that happens. We don't have a lot of, answers lots of times as to why.
I think of one of the places I've often had to work through with women is this idea that they think their really stressful job or their stressful life circumstance maybe did it. And I then have to, get them to see, but if that were the case, then most pregnancies wouldn't come to be, right? Like, that women are having babies and have had babies under excruciatingly stressful circumstances forever. So just because you worked really hard last week at your job, or you felt really stressful, you're really stressed, that did not cause your pregnancy loss, right? Like, having to, tell them, like, look out beyond your own circumstance. And let's remember, people are living all over the world under really stressful circumstances, and many of them have very successful pregnancies, right? So just like needing to challenge some of that thinking around wanting to find the place to blame.
The line I use all the time is, women have healthy babies in war zones. Mm-hmm. Right. And that's faulty logic. It doesn't actually make sense that's what happened here. Mm-hmm. And the other thing women say to me all the time is, like, that was my job. That was my one job, was to protect my baby and carry my baby, and the feeling like their body failed them too, right? And so lots of conversation around that, and reassuring them, and doing lots of processing around those feelings, and normalizing and validating that that's, of course they feel that way, but there's no evidence to suggest that that's what happened.
It sounds like this is a sort of a normal and natural first step into the grief process, if it's happening that much, right? And so no shaming if that's what you're going through, right? In that sense of, that's probably a normal and natural part. But once that gets untangled, let's say, and once that sense of responsibility or failure is sort of managed and dealt with, how is the grief different than other griefs?
It's the grief of what could have been, right? When I'm working with people who have lost a parent, or, a grandparent or a friend, or, they're grieving the memories, the things they did together, their favorite laughs, their favorite jokes. They're grieving phoning them up when they have like a problem, they're missing them. They're grieving that. And the parents I work with, didn't get to do any of that with their child. So they're grieving the what ifs. They're grieving, sometimes the grief will come back really strong when their child's would have been school age and they could have went to school. Those milestones, they're grieving the what could have been, right? They're grieving their family. They're grieving, if they have another child, their son having a sister, or, they're grieving that missing part and not getting to do those things with their child.
Yeah, that grieving of the future. And I think what really is difficult is when, women have a friend who's pregnant at the same time, and then one of them experiences that perinatal loss, and having to watch, and having to, I've heard so many of women have said to me, I couldn't go to the baby shower. I wanted to, but I just couldn't, is that bad of me? Is that, so there's every time they look around and they see, a mother with a newborn, it just totally brings that whole piece of future back, right? That was going to be that was my plan. That should be me pushing that stroller.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And that's, another thing I cover in the first session. Like, do you have any close people that are pregnant around you? Are you expecting any announcements? Can we talk about how to cope with that? It's a big part of it too. And David, that brings up the whole ripple effect. And I know that's come up on this podcast before, but that's something I've learned, especially with perinatal loss, I would say, is the ripple effect of other losses, the people that don't show up for you, that you're surprised about. And having worked with people dealing with other types of grief, it just seems especially poignant with the prenatal losses, because I think it's, again, because it is such a difficult, we don't talk about it a lot. You don't know how to cope with it. You don't know what to say. And so a lot of people avoid, if other people have children or are pregnant, they avoid, and so my clients just get this big ripple effect of, people that they thought would really be there for them that aren't, or people that are just really insensitive, like, it's been 6 months, it's been a year, like, snap out of it. Like,
you can have another one. You
can have another one. It's not like you even knew them, it's like, and the most painful things, right? At least, you can get pregnant, those kinds of things. And so, lots of times I talk about that. And then, on top of that, it's not all doom and gloom. I always like to ask, who has surprised them? And I have wonderful stories of one of my clients. It was the produce guy at the store that she went to. She went to the same grocery store every week, and she had been visibly pregnant, and then was back a few weeks later and no baby. And he said, "You're not pregnant anymore." And she said, "No, my baby died." And he said, "My wife and I lost a baby too." And then every week at the grocery store, he would say, "How are you doing?" And she, she would come to me and say, "My best friend can't call me, but the guy that's stalking the apples every week is my biggest supporter," And so I often tell that story too, because I hear the most beautiful stories about those things, like the people that do show up and that do provide support out of the most like unexpected places. Yeah.
I think sometimes what those who have not experienced it don't realize is that the moment you find out you're pregnant, your mind starts to spin this imaginary life with that little being, right?
Yeah.
And so, when people say, well, it's been this long, or, but you have a child, you're going to have another child. It's like, but what you don't realize is like your mind started to rewrite your life the moment you found out that you were pregnant. And so even though it might be invisible, your loss, or to others, it was very much alive within you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And that's, a really big thing that I think is a really important message to get across when we're talking about this kind of loss is, if I could give people advice that are listening, if you have someone in your life that's had a loss, like acknowledge. Like that's, people say, "Oh, I didn't want to say anything. What if they were having a good day?" Or no, it's on their mind all the time. Like they've already been through the worst thing that most people will go through. And you're not going to ruin their day by, asking how they're doing, saying sorry to hear about their baby, to check in, to use the baby's name. If it was a later loss and they named the baby, use the baby's name. Like that's very, very significant.
That's really interesting because whenever I met with a mom who had perinatal, I would always ask if she named the baby. And I can't remember anyone who said no.
Yeah.
And I've had many say, "I did, but I haven't told anybody." Mm-hmm. But the naming was important. And I think that's part of that initial piece you were talking about, Julie, around that. I want to just ask too, Tracy, where do the partners fit into all this in terms of how grief impacts them?
Yeah, I'll often do, I don't do couples work, but when there is a loss, I'll often invite the partner to come in to do some supportive work with both of them. And, I talk a lot about how people grieve differently, how it's hard to support each other in a couple because, one might be having a really sad day and one might be having a really angry day, or vice versa, and that's okay. And that's just involves a lot of communicating, and we talk about gender roles and how, sometimes men are pretty, socialized to fix. And so if their partner's crying a lot or going through, often if there's been a loss, people are given a package. So at the hospital, they do legacy boxes, especially with later losses. They'll do molds of hands and feet and give blankets and measuring tape for the baby, those kinds of things. There are early loss packages too. And I'll talk more about that before the end of the podcast. But sometimes, it's part of the grieving process to really go through that stuff and have a big cry and, touch all the molds and do all the things. And I've had, partners say to me, male partners in particular, say to me, like, I just don't like her going through that box. Like, she just cries. Like, I don't think it's good for her, and so doing a lot of educating around, like, no, she's okay. Like that's good. That's part of her processing. And just because she's crying or having a hard day doesn't mean that she's not okay. And then I'll have a lot of the women say to me, well, he's just over it. Like, I carried the baby. I felt more connected. And I feel like he's just over it. Like, he just seems fine. And I'll say, well, have you noticed, any kind of like different behavior? Does he seem a little angry? Sometimes I'll mention road rage and they'll be like, oh, that explains it. I had one client say, oh my goodness, yes, he took a TV from our garage that we were getting rid of into the backyard and beat it with a golf club, and I didn't know what he was doing. And I'll say that's grief, right? So it's a lot of, educating about how grief is played out differently amongst people. I do find so much protectiveness within the couples, so not wanting them to know how they're really doing, and they want to just make sure the other one's okay. And so I talk a lot about that too when I meet with them. Yeah.
When there is a later loss as opposed to an earlier loss, are there differences in terms of how the grief is experienced, or what people sort of tell you about the stories they tell you in those two different places? Are there different stories? Are there different sort of things that stand out that are important?
Yeah, I think what we've learned is that attachment happens at all different times in pregnancy. So sometimes you become attached the moment you pee on a stick. Sometimes it's when you hear that first heartbeat or when you see the ultrasound. And some people don't, experience attachment till they bring the baby home. And so I think the grief reaction depends on when that attachment started, right? So someone that feels attached the moment they pee on the stick might have quite a grief response even to a 6-week, 7-week, 8-week loss. Whereas, if they didn't feel the attachment as much because they hadn't done the heartbeat, the ultrasound, those kinds of things, their grief response might be not, a little bit different, right? Or not as intense. And so I think, as the pregnancy progresses, obviously there's more of those events that happen that may lead to attachment occurring, like the heartbeat, ultrasounds, those kinds of things. And then the whole, experience of the loss is just so different because with a later loss, typically if the baby's more formed, anything past 20 weeks, the baby will be born. They'll be encouraged to, provide some care for the baby. That can help a lot with the grief process. So name the baby, dress, maybe bath the baby. The Peterborough Regional Health Center, due to amazing donations from families and the Butterfly Run, has been able to purchase something that's called cuddle cots. And so they are basically bassinets that have a cooling feature so that the baby's body will stay more preserved and the parents can actually spend the night with the baby. And get pictures and introduce the family members. And I try to educate my clients on that too, because, someone sitting at home might be listening to this thinking, what? That sounds so different, not something you would expect, maybe even a little morbid, but it's been shown to just help so much with the grief process, and you can ask, who did the baby look like? And, can you show me some pictures? And they'll often have pictures with lots of family, and so it can be quite beautiful. I would say later loss gets more of that experience, right? So anything 20 weeks and younger may not get that kind of experience, which, it can be really difficult too.
That is so true, Tracy. And I would always ask moms if they had a picture. And it amazed me that how many of them did. And they had it there and they would show me. And just... They would sometimes say, I don't show this to everybody, but, when you ask, and there it is. But what it helps to just give them a sense of, this grief, this person's important to me. And the photo was, that's always something that surprised me.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I mean, that used to be quite normal in days gone by to have those postmortem pictures of young children that had died or even grown-ups that had died, to have that family photo. And if you don't look at them closely enough, you don't realize one of the people in the photo isn't alive, right? And so that's really interesting to hear that they do that at the hospital.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
I can imagine how important it is to hold your baby.
Yeah, very important. And do some of those parental things like bathe, dress, care for. It's the only time they get to do that, right? And yeah.
And that's a change, because I know my mother, one of her relatives, she had a miscarriage and they just took the baby. She never did see the baby. They just took the baby, and and what she told me was they just disposed of it. Mm-hmm. And that's the language that was used. What are the legal pieces now around burial? Is there an age that requires that?
Yeah, so I think it's 20 weeks gestation or 100 grams, depending on what the baby weighs, fetus weighs. More and more people are asking, even below that, if they can take the remains and do a burial, which can happen. There are some funeral homes in town that will waive the costs and fees, which is lovely, for the 20 weeks and above, when there does have to be a burial and naming and all of that. So that's very kind and nice, and generous in town, because, parents haven't been saving money for a funeral. So it can be quite a financial burden if they have to do that or cover the cost.
On that note, something I have learned along the way with a few clients who, where their baby was cremated, they carry the ashes around with them, or when they leave the house, they bring the ashes with them. And of course, and I can remember in one case, the person was saying, other people were like thinking that was a problem. And so she came to a session with me and said, like they think I'm not doing okay, that I'm not coping, because the other day, like, I couldn't leave without bringing the ashes. And I was like, well, of course it was still quite a new grief. And I said, of course, a mother doesn't leave her baby at home and walks out the door, and she wasn't ready to do that. And so, like, I'm just giving that as an example around how we can support people, right? Is like not to see that as strange. It's like, it's normal. You want to bring your baby with you. That's normal. We'll talk about that if a lot of time goes on, we may continue to revisit that, but it's okay that you need to bring your baby with you. Mm-hmm. Have you seen that?
Yo, absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And then I always use David's line, actually. Nothing's weird in the first year.
Exactly.
When it comes to grief.
I have used that line myself. Yes.
And I say that all the time. And I say, this is from David Kennedy. Nothing is weird.
It's not weird. It's what feels right to you.
Absolutely.
And that's the activation of that attachment system.
Yes.
Because good mothers don't leave their babies alone.
Yes.
Right?
Yes.
They don't leave their babies. So and you will hear them talk about how their arms physically ache not holding their babies. Like, you'll hear them talk about the somatic symptoms of that.
I've heard of that a lot. Mm-hmm. Arms aching, sore back, lots of that. Very common. Also hearing a baby cry, hearing, the pitter patter of baby steps, all very, very normal part of that grief process. And so,
but then that's when they start to question their sanity, or
absolutely.
like, am I okay? That's just, I think, that activation of that attachment system, that
absolutely.
the system was primed for that.
Yep. And then I just returned to the nothing weird in the first year. Let's keep talking about that. Another thing I would say too, that's super important, not only that asking the name and looking at a picture if they have it, is also asking for their birth story. They gave birth, and especially, like, again, above 20 weeks, later loss. And, I think it's such a rite of passage to tell your birth story as a woman. And, many of my clients say, like, nobody even asks me. Or when they go on to have subsequent pregnancies and subsequent babies, like, they keep giving me advice. Like, I don't know what labor's like. Like, I've been in labor. I've had a baby, and so kind of being cognizant of that too. At least being curious about it. Do you want to talk about it? Do you want to tell me?
Well, that's just makes so much sense, because that's what's on your mind. Mm-hmm. And like saying the name of someone who has died, especially if it's a child or an adult, I guess it doesn't really matter, the acknowledgement that you've gone through something, and how disrespectful or hurtful it can be to have that ignored, right? Especially if it was maybe an earlier pregnancy death. It's invisible. And so that just makes it more invisible, because we're not even talking about it anymore. Mm-hmm. And how alone does that make me feel as a person in my grief? So where do I take that?
And that's that disenfranchisement, right?
Exactly.
That's where we're not allowed to talk about it, or other people don't let us talk about it.
Exactly.
And so we just hold that in, and that just complicates things, right? That just...
Yeah, and I've had clients, trying to get back out there in the social scene, and, after they've had a late loss, especially, and, their neighbor took them to some, girls get together. And my client said she'd obviously told everybody that I had lost a baby. And so she said, I felt like I walked in and everyone was like, that's the one. That's the one that lost the baby, and clients will talk about feeling like they're a part of this club that nobody wants to be a part of, like the dead baby club, or the mothers of lost club. And, it's a club no one wants to be a part of. And it's a lonely club at times. Now, I will say, I said I wanted to talk about the packages. I think it's important to talk about the Peterborough Butterfly Run at this point. It's a very successful event that started probably 6 years ago. It ran for a few years, and then we had to break for 2 years over COVID, and then it's been back for, I think, at least 2 years. And I was approached on the street outside Pipsy one day by two women that I knew in the community, and they said, have you ever heard of a butterfly run? We want to bring one to Peterborough. And I sure, that sounds great. So this group of moms who had all had losses got together and created probably one of the most successful fundraising, run events in town. And it is just so important. The event itself is so important for community and for families to all come out and do it. And they have a Facebook page. They've created a lending library. So there's a lending library at Pipsy, so I can give books, out to clients. It doesn't matter if they bring them back because I can get more. And then they've created these care packages that are just so important. Early loss and late loss care packages that are full of just lovely care items, nice Kleenex and tea and chocolate and a coloring book and a letter from a lost parent, saying like, you're going through this really hard time, but I promise it will get better. As a clinician working in this field, it's been so nice to be able to hand my clients something tangible that they can take home with them, full of ththings that help them to feel less alone.
And to feel so cared for by their community.
Yes.
Like when you said about the letter from a parent, like my eyes welled up there. I was like, how meaningful that would be to be able to read a letter from somebody else.
Yes. Yeah. I've been there. I know this feels terrible. Yeah. I promise you're not alone. And so the early loss was written by a parent who's experienced an early loss, and the late loss letter was written by somebody experienced a late loss. So, if you are someone listening to this who's had a loss and who's feeling really alone out there, the Butterfly Run, check out their website. They always look for volunteers for the run or participate in the run. It's every May. Late April, early May. And it's just such a great event. And I do feel like they've just done such great work in this community, to remove some of the stigma, to do some of the education so that people, know that there is a community out there and that you're not alone, and that there is, ways that you can be cared for.
I'm so thankful to hear that, Tracy, and hear about the work. And we are so fortunate in this community to have the Partners in Pregnancy and all of the resources there. I'm sitting here also very aware that an older generation, my generation, I guess I have to say that, where perinatal loss was not acknowledged and was hidden. So when I have done grief seminars around, when I'm finished, most cases, I have had older women come up to me because I will make mention of perinatal loss and as valid grief. And I will have so many older women come to me and with tears and just saying, I've never been able to talk about it. Nobody knows this. I've never told anybody. And I've carried this. And we're talking in some cases, 40, 50 years ago, and it's still raw in them now. But that generation did not have a chance to both get supported like I'm hearing from you tonight, and also from society to be able to do that. What do we say to women of that generation who maybe have had a perinatal loss 30, 40 years ago? What do we say to them now? How do we help them?
Well, first, I always say I'm sorry. I'm sorry that was your experience and that it took this long to get to where we are today. My mom had a loss, and she did the butterfly run the first year with me and my sister. And she talked about how meaningful that was for her. Her loss had been 35, 40 years plus ago. And it meant a lot to her to walk that, so I think it's never too late to find a way. And then I presented to my mental health clinician team at Family Health Team. So we all get together as a group. So the other mental health clinicians attached to family doctors. And I showed them the packages. I went through them and showed the packages that the Butterfly Run puts out. And I was contacted by one of my colleagues, and he was working with a woman who had had a loss 50 years prior. And he asked for an early loss kit for her, and he went through it with her. And that was very meaningful for her. So that's also possible. If somebody would like one of those kits to go through it and connect with that loss so long ago, I think that can be really meaningful too.
Wow. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Makes so much sense to me, because how many times have we said in previous episodes, our grief needs to be witnessed, right? It deserves to be heard. It deserves to take up space in the world, and it doesn't go away. It doesn't go away. But if it can be held with tenderness and kindness, it can be changed in us in the way that we carry it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Tracy, I know, because I've been part of one of your workshops, I know that you also do some training with healthcare providers and around how we can support women who are coming through offices and places who are experiencing this loss. And I just wanted to give you a opportunity to speak to any of that. Anything you want to say?
Sure. Yeah, that was also thanks to the Butterfly Run.
Mm-hmm.
They sponsored me to go and get some extra training through a group in the US called Resolve Through Sharing. Through that, I've been able to provide some training for healthcare providers. Exactly, like just about a lot of the things that we've already talked about, like how to acknowledge, what to say, what not to say, how to support, how to take care of ourselves doing this work too. And it's been really meaningful to be able to share, kind of what I've learned, and to, build capacity in our community to have healthcare providers provide really good care in this, really difficult situation. So that's been really meaningful too.
I'm sitting here thinking, well, I'm so glad you came. I'm so glad we're having this conversation, because I'm sort of coming to the end of it, and I'm thinking that, like so many other things, but again, to repeat it, that sense, the light of truth has the ability to eliminate the shame that we talked about at the beginning. And decrease isolation at a time when people need the support the most. And I think that is true for all things. But tonight on this topic, it just became really poignant for me how, if we can bring this out of the shadows, right? If we can say, this happens 1 out of every 4 times. So it's not something to hide and keep to yourself for 30 or 40 years and carry that burden alone. And so I'm just sitting over here in the corner thinking, wow, it's wonderful to hear your voice sort of saying, it's okay. It's okay. And you're okay. You're going through something that's real, and you don't need to go through it alone. And I just think of the history of the human race, where we just isolate people with shame or feelings of insecurity or fault or whatever it might be. So I would say thank you for this work, and thank you for coming and having this conversation with us, because I think it's an important one, because if 1 in 4, there's a lot of people out here who have had that experience, and then everybody will know somebody who has had that experience.
Mm-hmm.
And I think too, Tracy, again, I want to say thank you, and I appreciate so much your work and the way in which you approach that. I do want to just comment on, and maybe Red, you being in the corner and me being here as men, we kind of feel that we can't experience this grief the same way. But I am very aware that partners, and partners aren't always male, but as a gender male, I think we do feel it, but I don't think we know what to do with it. And we don't know what to do. As you said, I loved what you said about they play the protection game. And we're trying to protect our partner so much that we hold our own in, and we inadvertently perhaps give a message that we don't care or we're over it. Sometimes that is expressed, that men just don't get that piece. But I think there's many who do. I mean, our future hopes and wishes and dreams is in that child too. And so I think recognizing that's an important grief that has to be acknowledged. But thank you again. And I, without belaboring it, I don't know why I'm so aware of women, older women who have had miscarriages years ago, who have carried this. And thank you for the opportunity given for some very practical things to do. But basically what we're saying is acknowledge it, talk to somebody, tell somebody, and tell them your experience in that and the name of that child, because I know you have one. I think there's probably a lot of people listening to this who can perhaps pull out pieces that apply to them very directly. So thank you, Tracy.
So Tracy, as we begin to wrap up this conversation, I just wanted to turn it over to you and ask, is there anything we haven't covered that's important that we speak to?
Obviously, I could talk about this topic for days. It's just such an important thing to cover. And I think, these losses are really complicated. And I think it's important to mention, there are other types of perinatal loss that we haven't covered tonight. Some parents are faced with a life-limiting diagnosis for their baby, and they have to make the most difficult, unfathomable decision around continuing the pregnancy or not. And that's another part of the perinatal loss realm that I provide support in. And we talk about the shame and the stigma around stillbirth, miscarriage, the things we've covered tonight. And I think this is another example of one of those types of grief that's very lonely, very disenfranchised. Thankfully, there are groups like PALE online that have specialized groups for parents that have faced that type of decision making and that type of hardship. So, thankfully, with these specialized cases and these specialized types of grief, there are specific places where people can go to get help. But I think it's worth mentioning, that it's a very complicated, layered topic. And, the stories and cases that I've passed or that I've dealt with over the years, have just taught me so much. A lot of my learning has come from my clients, I have to say.
Isn't that true?
Yeah.
For all of us.
Yes. Yeah. Mm-hmm. So while I've had extra training, most of it has come from parents telling me what this feels like. PALE stands for the Pregnancy and Infant Loss Network, and it's run out of Sunnybrook. And so highly recommend it. As far as I talked about the prongs, it's the prong of peer support. They provide lots of peer support groups, and they also do training for professionals too. So they've really, they got a lot of funding in the last, I'm going to say, decade, and they've really increased their capacity and provide a lot of support to families.
Maybe one of my final questions to you that we often ask our guests is, how has this work changed you? Because as you just mentioned, our clients teach us so much. And when we're privileged enough to walk this, what can be a very isolating, very hard time with them, they teach us things and it changes us.
I think, it has taught me that humans are amazing and so resilient and can survive the most unthinkable situations. It's taught me that children are really good at grief and can come up with the coolest symbols for their lost siblings, whether it's a butterfly or a ladybug or a star in the sky. And, I often am directing parents to ask their kids how they want to remember the lost baby, and just, how people can show up and how people can support one another, and how some people just intuitively know what to do in really, really difficult situations, and how beautiful that can be.
Lovely. Thank you, Tracy.
Thanks.
Thank you for listening to What Now? on the threshold of life, death, and grief. What Now is produced in partnership with Hospice Peterborough, dedicated to providing compassionate care and support to individuals and families facing life-limiting illness and loss. What Now is recorded at Thin Spaces Studio in Peterborough, Ontario. Special thanks to Paradise Garage for providing the music. Technical support is provided by Sean Heichert and audio engineering by Kevin Fleming. More episodes of What Now are available for free on most major podcast platforms. If you found value in our conversations, please support us by following, leaving a 5-star review, and sharing with your friends and loved ones. If you'd like to support the essential work of Hospice Peterborough, please consider visiting hospicepeterborough.org/donate. Your contribution helps us to continue to provide vital care and support. Until next time, may you find peace and comfort on your journey.